Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Scientists around the world are working on potential treatments and vaccines for COVID-19. Several companies are working on antiviral drugs, some of which are already in use against other illnesses to treat people infected with COVID-19. Others are working on vaccines that could be used as a preventive measure against the disease. Meanwhile, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who heads the U.S. National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and is a key member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force, told National Public Radio Thursday that there's a chance that hundreds of millions of doses of a potential COVID-19 vaccine could be available by early next year. Incidentally, the U.S. federal government has not approved a vaccine so far. We talked about vaccines on this program a couple of weeks ago, but there's another question that needs to be answered. How effective will a vaccine be when we get one? On 22nd April, Dr. David States, Chief Medical Officer at Angstrom Bio in Austin, Texas, took to Twitter and wrote a thread. He began by saying, and I'm quoting from his tweet, "If you're hoping a vaccine is going to be a knight in the shining armor, saving the day, you may be in for a disappointment. SARS-CoV-2 is a highly contagious virus. A vaccine will need to induce durable high-level immunity, but coronaviruses often don't induce that kind of immunity," unquote. He then goes on to give us reasons for why that is or would be. So I will subsequently read out from some of the tweets in the thread were required while questioning the panel, but let me first introduce them. We are joined today by Imogen Peter, who's currently working for a member of parliament in Westminster. She is deputy chairman at Parliament Street, a leading parliamentary think tank, and also a local council candidate. We also have with us Dr. Shaukat Ali, who's assistant professor and principal, Dow College of Biotechnology, and joins us from Karachi. Let me first go to Dr. Ali with a question. So we've been talking about vaccines. As I said in my opening a couple of weeks ago, we talked to two experts about how long it'll take a vaccine to come online. But now this thread that I'm talking about in terms of even when we do get a vaccine, it's not going to be a knight in the shining armor, to quote Dr. States. What is your reading of that?
Well, I think because we have to learn from the coronavirus vaccine that have been used for the veterinary side, on the poultry side, there has not been a lot of success in there. There have been failures and success. And that's the kind of success and failures we are expecting when we have vaccines here for the coronavirus, for the COVID-19. So yeah, the whole world is trying, and then we have to just wait for the trials to go ahead and see what happens. But from the past, like there have been failures and there have been success. And partly the reason is that this virus causes infection in the mucosal lining, and the immunity is required on the mucosal lining as well. And it is difficult to get long-lasting mucosal lining because that needs a lot of booster doses as well. So I think we're just going to have to wait for the trials to go ahead around the world. And in the meantime, we have to look for the other interventions that could be done, like antiviral therapy. There are other antiviral therapies that people have been trying to find, like passive immunization, one of the kind that we are working on at the moment. These are the sort of things that people need to keep trying in between when the vaccine is in making. Like, we should not be putting a lot of hope with it. We should just wait for the trial to go ahead. And in the meantime, other interventions that world could do, the scientific community could do, we should try to find other antiviral modalities also.
Okay, so by nature, viruses mutate. Now, the DNA viruses are relatively more stable than RNA viruses. And this one, presumably, is an RNA virus. So when you talk about boosters, you're saying that we get the vaccine, and then we're going to see how long it will protect the person from the disease, and then he or she is going to get a booster. Have I read you correctly here?
Exactly. This is one of the problem with where the immunity required for mucosal lining. When the pathogen is trying to invade through the mucosal lining, then immunity is required on the mucosal lining as well, not only humoral immunity. And in that case, it is difficult to keep that lasting for longer, and that is why boosters will be required. Genetic drifting and shifting is another aspect of that. But even if it doesn't mutate a lot, if it is invading through the mucosal lining, respiratory tract lining, the mucosa of the respiratory tract, still then we can't hope that just one dose will work and it will provide long-lasting immunity.
So, Dr. Ali, let me take back in history. So, in 1918, there was the flu pandemic, which obviously it's a great misnomer to call it the Spanish influenza because it never started in Spain, but nonetheless. So, when we go back and we look at that, there were lots of, drugs used. As a matter of fact, very high doses of aspirin were recommended by doctors, which actually ended up killing people through aspirin poisoning and the rest of it. But when we now go back and look at how that happened, and there are different figures from 20 million to 50 to a very high figure of 100 million people killed across the globe, yet ultimately, it had more to do with what we call herd immunity. I mean, we've got the flu shots now, but how many people in Pakistan, for instance, get the flu shots? But lots of people do get flu, they don't necessarily die unless they have some comorbidity. So are we saying that at some point, regardless of whether we get the vaccine for this or not, or assuming that we do, that there will also be immunity in the general population where people would not necessarily need to be inoculated in order to survive an COVID-19 attack?
Well, things cannot be said with certainty at the moment. Like, there is a lot of data going on. There are a lot of news going on. Like yesterday, I read about that when somebody was telling about the resurgence of coronavirus in the patient, the relapse in the patient, it came out that it was not true. So there's a lot of data being generated. We just have to look at the authenticity of the data. And I think it will not be fair to comment on the limited data that we have available at the moment. Looking at the Spanish flu that you called it, we have to just hope that we get the herd immunity and we get the blessing of the God and we get the herd immunity at the end. But nothing can be said at the moment with certainty. There is not enough data to say that.
I'm happy that you mentioned the unknowns. I will return to you, Dr. Ali, with some more technical questions, but let me hop over to Ms. Peter here. Ms. Peter, given the unknowns, given the uncertainties, governments across the world are actually making policies in an environment of uncertainty. Give me a sense of how the UK is coping with this. I mean, there was a partial lockdown, then there was what has now been termed as the dance, you're opening up smartly and hoping that it can be contained.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, at the moment, we are still in a full state of lockdown. If you don't need to leave the house, you don't. But the UK government is providing around £250 million to the international effort to find a vaccine, as well as putting £45 million behind two world-leading projects through the Oxford University and the Imperial College of London. So we've begun the first human trials here on the 23rd of April, which has seen several hundred people have the test vaccine administered. So we are looking at ways to find a vaccine. In the meantime, we are keeping with the lockdown procedures until a later date. We are also rolling out contact tracing, which has seen us recruit around 18,000 contact tracing volunteers. And this is to trace people using mobile phone technology who have been in contact with those infected with the virus.
So after Prime Minister Johnson was infected, and of course he went through that period of treatment and all that, and he came out of it, fortunately, and then he made this rather moving speech thanking the NHS. But you know that there's been a lot of criticism of how funding had been cut down for NHS. Now, given Prime Minister Johnson's own experience, do you think that's going to have some kind of salutary impact on funding for the NHS and other R&D in terms of, dealing with pathogens and generally the healthcare system itself?
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, we've seen the government has increased their funding towards the NHS as well as all these other research schemes going around. We've also seen that Oxford University has teamed up with AstraZeneca to try and improve the manufacturing for when these vaccines are available. So there's definitely a lot of funds being thrown behind the research as well as the NHS from the government at the moment. And we've seen with when Boris Johnson has come back to work, he has also said that he's not considering relaxing the lockdown for at least the next couple of weeks until we do know more about how this virus is reacting.
Absolutely. Now, here's the question. Since, as I said, even when a vaccine is there, is not necessarily going to be very effective given the level of contagion of this virus. So are we looking at, for instance, in your case, you're looking at life in the UK, is this being some kind of inflection point after which the social distancing that we're practicing today is going to more or less become a norm? Is there a sense that we have entered a new phase in terms of how we're going to go about everyday work?
Yeah, well, it does look to be that way. I mean, for the foreseeable future, until there is a vaccine that we know that works, social distancing is going to become a part of everyday life. So with those trials I mentioned before, we're not even going to start seeing results as to how the test vaccine is working till at least mid-June. Now, Sarah Gilbert, who's leading the project, has also come out and said that there's about an 80% chance of seeing some sort of progress in this vaccine and seeing whether or not it works. So at least until we start seeing some of the trial results come in, social distancing is just a part of everyday life.
Okay. Stay with me, Ms. Peter. Let me go, Dr. Ali. Dr. Ali, let me read out something which David States mentioned. And since this is technical jargon, I would want you to sort of put it in English for me. He says there's a nice preprint just out on antibody responses to SARS-CoV-2. Lots of people don't develop much of an IgM response, and the IgG response fades noticeably after just 2 months. So put it in English for me.
Right. So, the IgG and IgM that he's talking about is IgM is the antibodies that develop once a person is suffering from a disease, and that's the initial response of antibodies that a person generates. And IgG is the later response, and it is the more lasting response, is the more effective response, or the more prevalent response is IgG, but which appears in the later stages of the disease. So the appearance of IgM or not making enough IgM and disappearing of IgG that quick in 2 months' time, that means a person that was infected with the virus initially, after 2 months of time, that person could succumb to it again, and that's what it actually means, that not having enough immunity once the person is contracting the COVID-19 virus. That means actually it's not providing long-lasting immunity to a person. That means the virus can come back again, and at the moment we don't want we don't know even if the virus is going to come back, is going to be a changed virus in terms of its genetics or in terms of its physiology, or is it the same virus that's going to come back? But still, we know from what the data is mentioned, what he's trying to say, it's not going to be long-lasting immunity.
Okay. Doctor, one other thing. So this virus does its own damage, of course, but in terms of the body's response to it, in terms of the body's own internal defenses, how important are several comorbidities in terms of either fighting back or succumbing to the damage that this virus does?
Right. So immune system is the most important tool that a person has to fight the virus. But at one point of time, when it sees a lot of inflammation in the lungs, the own immune markers, they start working against the body, and then it's a two-edged sword. So that's why people who have got compromised immune system or whose immune system is overreacting to things, both of them could easily succumb to the virus. And that's why we have seen a lot of data where people were elderly people dying, where people who had compromised immune system, they are dying. It is the later stage of the disease when immune markers they also start working against the body. But in the initial stage, if someone has got a competent immune system, it is easier to fight diseases like or comorbidities like diabetes, like hypertension, like cardiac markers. They don't let the person respond it in a way, in an efficient way, or mount an efficient immune response to the virus to fight it off. And that's why people you see more of the people, the more mortalities that you see are the people who had comorbidities like diabetes, like smokers, like people who have got cardiac problems already existing. So yeah, these comorbidities actually add to the adversity of the person suffering from the virus, and that's why they are adding to the mortality rate wherever you see these comorbidities. And doctors and clinicians, they are alert when they see these comorbidities, that they treat it with caution as well.
Okay, so it brings me to another question, which is that hypertension, diabetes, and cardiovascular conditions are fairly common in a certain age group in Pakistan. But what we have seen is that the mortality rate of COVID-19 patients relative to the number of infected, and of course the number of infected can be much more, and that always depends on how aggressively we can test. But that seems to suggest that the Pakistani population, also the Indian and the Bangladeshi population, and they have the same problem in terms of hypertension, diabetes, heart conditions and the rest of it, and these comorbidities that you're talking about, that relatively speaking, the response of the population has been more resilient and robust compared to, let's say, the Northern Hemisphere.
Yes, it looks like it could be some lack of data as well. But on the contrary, if you see Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Indian people, they are living in the standard, their hygiene, and their exposure to different antigens or pathogens is much more than the people living in Northern Hemisphere. And maybe that's their heightened immunity level that's helping them out in terms of being resilient. So this we need to look at the data more carefully, and we need to wait for further data. But if you ask me to pinpoint one factor, that could be maybe just high immunity level in these people, because in their daily life they are more exposed to pathogens or antigens than any other population, and that's why their immune system is quite alert. And that's maybe is the reason they are fighting it off better than the other side of the world.
Okay, very quick question before I wrap up. Have you seen the patient load in hospitals go up, or is it the normal patient load?
Well, what we see from the media, because this is what the and the government website, the number of patients is increasing. The May is appearing a bit more critical than, and it was expected as well that May will go a bit dangerous, and the number of persons infected with coronavirus will increase. It is increasing side by side. If you talk about Pakistan, I think the testing numbers are increasing also, and then maybe that's the reason we see this rise in the number of patients in this month of May. Right from the start of this month of May, we have seen this increase, and also when in the last week of the April, the number started increasing, and it was a bit expected as well.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Shaukat Ali. Thank you also to Imogen Pater for speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the Hindutva madness that has taken hold of India. Stay with us. Welcome back to India Special. India claims to be the world's most populous democracy. The world capitals agree. But is that a fact? Interstate interests linked to a large market aside, India's democracy is not just illiberal. The country under the RSS government of Narendra Modi has evidenced clear fascist trends. How do states and societies degenerate into collective madness? On March 23, 1933, the unanimous support of the Catholic Centre Party gave Adolf Hitler the necessary two-thirds majority in the Reichstag for the enabling act and thus the legal authority to amend the Weimar Constitution without parliamentary supervision and thereby to impose a dictatorship over Germany. Sociologist Ivan Amakov called it ruling oneself out, a theory of collective abdications. The Hindutva right wing has been propagating that COVID-19 has been spread by Muslims. Social media campaign asks Hindus to not buy vegetables from Muslim shopkeepers and costermongers. Muslims are regularly lynched. The controversial Citizenship Amendment Act singles out and excludes Muslims. The Indian-occupied and annexed Kashmir remains under lockdown. The government of Indian-occupied Kashmir has told India's Supreme Court that the right to access the internet is not a fundamental right. The court is hearing a petition filed by the Foundation for Media Professionals for restoring 4G internet access in the valley. In its reply, the government said free speech and expression, including trade and internet access, can be curtailed in general public interest. It said the internet ban is not only least restrictive, but also most appropriate and has reasonable nexus with the purpose to achieve state security. It also claimed that high-speed internet restoration will lead to the glorification of, you guessed it, Pakistan Army and freedom fighters. None of this is propaganda or made up by Pakistan. There's empirical evidence of all this. Here's some before we get to our panel. There are tons of clips, but we cannot really run all of them because of copyrights. But here are some tweets that I can share with you and which you will see on your screen also. And then we're going to show some clips before we go to our panel. So this one is by Shekhar Gupta, an eminent journalist, who says, who basically quotes Arun Anand, CEO of RSS affiliate Indraprastha Vishwa Samvad Kendra, who says Pakistan trying to influence Indian Muslims to violate the COVID-19 lockdown. Times of India, Delhi riots, 85-year-old's young killers used to greet her in locality. BBC News India, the BBC has found Delhi police acted along Hindu rioters during a wave of attacks on Muslims last week. Punjab CM Captain Amrinder Singh sends a copy of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf to SAD President Sukhbir Badal, asking him to read it and learn from history. The Indian Express says what happened under Hitler is unfolding in India now, quoting Amrinder Singh on the Citizenship Amendment Act. Yashwant Sinha says Modi's massive roadshow in Varanasi today reminds me of the crowds that used to assemble for Hitler in Nazi Germany. Nationalists of Hindu Mahasabha recreate Mahatma Gandhi's assassination. This is just some of the stuff that is everywhere on the social media and is generally talked about by the Bhakts and other Hindutva Sangh Parivar people on the social media. But here are some clips.
Because we already have a model in the world. I don't know why we don't follow it. It has happened in the Middle East. You have to look at if the Israeli people can do it, we can also. And you give some time, you will see what is going to happen. I believe the security conditions in Jammu and Kashmir will improve. It will allow refugees to go back. And in your lifetime, you will be able to go back. And you will be able to visit your villages. You will be able to go back to your home. And you will find security. Because we already have a model in the world. I don't know why we don't follow it. It has happened in the Middle East. You have to look at if the Israeli people can do it, we can also.
बहुत दिन चलेगा नहीं ये। हम सबको मालूम है कि आने वाला समय और आने वाला दिशा क्या होने जा रही है। ये हिंदुत्व की सदी है और हिंदुत्व की सदी केवल भारत की नहीं दुनिया की सदी होगी। पूरी दुनिया के अंदर हिंदुत्व का झंडा एक बार पुनः मजबूती के साथ भगवा झंडा दुनिया के अंदर कोने कोने में लहराएगा।
This is just a sample. The actual action begins now. So let's go to the panel. We have Michael Kugelman with us, who's Deputy Director, Asia Program, South Asia Senior Associate at the Wilson Center. We also have with us Tony Ashai, who's an analyst, joins us from Los Angeles. Let me begin with Michael here. Michael, as I said, collective madness. I mean, this is an extremely slippery slope. And, you know, this is like if we go back to the first tenure of Narendra Modi, there was a slight build-up. We had Love Jihad and Ghar Wapsi and the rest of it. But this tenure, it has become far more overt and very, very aggressive. What would you say?
I think you're right, Ijaz. I think it's in the second term of Modi that we've seen the previous manifestations of Islamophobia go much further, in which it appears to be something systematic through the citizenship law, through the registry that were mentioned, through the increase in lynchings, something symptomatic to suggest a very formal effort to target the very large Muslim community. And of course, as you know, and as I think we've discussed on this program before, the BJP, the ruling party, for a very long time in its formal agenda and its election manifestos, has indicated a desire to do the types of things that are happening right now. But it did take some time. The question is why it took some time. It could be various factors. One is the fact that the BJP now has such a large ruling majority, I think the largest one that it's ever had. I think you could also look at the worsening economic distress in India, which is will be compounded by the coronavirus, which I think gives the government an incentive to try to push out that agenda even more, to distract the rank and file and to appease the rank and file. So it very much is a disturbing state of affairs. Though one more point to add some more context, we've seen the communal violence, communal tensions. This has happened for all of India's history. I mean, well before the latest BJP government came to power, there were cases of forced conversions, attacks on minorities, these Hindu militant groups staging attacks. That's not something that's only come suddenly when the Modi government has been in power. I think that's an important point to mention there. But indeed, I worry that what we've seen over the last 2 years represents something that goes beyond mere Islamophobia. Of course, that's bad enough. I really worry about something systematic, and indeed, that is and should be a major concern for all of us.
Absolutely. Communal rioting is new to India, but Michael, what I see and what I sense is that there is now a certain kind of ideology at work which is actually supported by highest echelons of the government. And I think that is something which sends out a very negative signal to the street. And I will get back to you on this, but let me pull in Tony Ashai here. Mr. Ashai, your reading of today's India, and then let's talk some about the Indian-occupied Kashmir rules.
Well, I think you have to understand the background where these Modi and Amit Shahs come from. They come from RSS group, and RSS has a bigger agenda. And their agenda is a greater India, which is from Afghanistan to Indonesia, from Kashmir to Sri Lanka. And they want to, and they're dreaming of this huge Indian empire to bring back the old Indian pride, which they have been brainwashed to believe that that was true, even though that was not true. India was never a one big, massive country. There were a lot of little countries and little kingdoms that made India. So I think that there are these people who now rule India. Modi is one of them. And BJP being in majority in parliament, they can literally pass any law. There is no checks and balances anymore. They've got the president in place who is from BJP, who ultimately signs anything that the prime minister tells him. They've got courts, they've got judges in place in Supreme Courts and high courts. I mean, they've got everything in place to basically do whatever they want to do. So I feel that this is a very, very dangerous time in India, and India could go in completely a wrong direction, which will be a problem for the region.
Okay. As I said, let's talk about the Indian-occupied and annexed Kashmir. As I said in my opening, the response of the administration in that occupied territory to the Indian Supreme Court is essentially is a matter of doubling down on what has been done earlier.
When it comes to Kashmir, Indian-occupied Kashmir, and the Muslims living in Kashmir versus the Muslims living in India, these are two separate things. Muslims living in India have, or their previous generations have chosen to be with India. Kashmiris have never chosen to be with India. Kashmiris who have been occupied. They were promised that there will be referendums and right of self-determination, but that never happened. So there's a huge difference between the Muslims of Kashmir and Muslims of India. Muslims of India to Kashmiris are Indians, but Kashmiris are not Indians. So there's a big difference. And, you know, the Supreme Court said whatever Indian Supreme Court, like I said, the judges and everybody's in place, that they are set up. The justice system is not for everybody in India at this point. It's all rigged. Everything is rigged in India. I'm sorry to say, but India is not what it used to be. It is in a bad shape, and anybody on the wrong side of this government right now will have to suffer because they've got everything in place.
Absolutely. Let me go back to Michael here. Michael, so I was saying that there's some qualitative difference here. Now, let me talk about two other institutions. One is the Indian Army, which prided itself on being apolitical, but in occupied Kashmir has always been the thin end of the policy wedge and has actually dictated policy. And the other was the Indian higher judiciary. But we have seen that the Indian Supreme Court's decisions, like for instance on the Babri Mosque and certain other decisions, have not really, shown a good light. And one gets a sense that these institutions are kind of following in the footsteps of the RSS ideology. Is that your sense also?
Well, I wouldn't want to overstate the increasingly political roles of those two institutions that you mentioned. Certainly, it's been notable that there have been several senior military officials that have made some public comments about politics over the last few years or so. And certainly, indeed, with the Supreme Court, you mentioned its decision on the Babri Mosque, and also, as I recall, the Supreme Court didn't seem particularly seized of or interested in or concerned about the citizenship law issue when that was brought to its attention, as I recall. But I think that India likes to wear the world's largest democracy label on its sleeve, and that certainly is under fire. But I do think we need to acknowledge that for the most part, the military remains subservient to the civilian leadership in India, and I don't think that the court is overstretching or is being politicized in ways that one could be concerned about down the road. But you mentioned the term slippery slope. We mentioned the trends of what's happening. I think that what we're seeing on the ground now could suggest that down the line, those two critical institutions could start acting in ways being more politicized than they really should be. But at this point, at least, that's one area where I remain somewhat sanguine, but not necessarily beyond the immediate or medium term.
Okay, but here's the thing, and I was talking to some senior former Indian Army officers. This is about 4 months ago, pre-corona track 2. And we were just talking about, Rawat's statements. We were talking about, and one of them had something very interesting to say and said, well, he's now the CDS. And I was like, okay, and he said, how do you think he became the CDS? Now, that essentially means that, you were prepared, senior officers are prepared to shelve their professionalism in order to get on the right side of the RSS government's ideology in order to go up the ladder. Now, this may be just one-off, but when we look at certain other incidents of senior officers attending convocations and seminars being held by right-wing groups, then one begins to worry about the direction in which the Indian Army might be headed.
No, this is very true, and one cannot simply shrug off this issue, and particularly when you look at the issue, when you look at Kashmir, when you look at Jammu and Kashmir, which of course we know about its status as determined by India after the revocation of Article 370, but clearly in that region, I mean, the army is everything in the sense that it's everywhere, it's omnipresent, its presence is described as an occupation routinely. And so that suggests that we need to be very much watching how the army, not just on the ground operationally, but institutionally, how its role is being changed. how someone like Rawat, what his new position could entail. I don't know. I think it's too early, and I don't want to speculate that much. But indeed, I think these are certainly issues to keep in mind moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Michael Kugelman speaking to us. Let me go back to Mr. Ashai. Mr. Ashai, there are lots of these trends that I think, and it's kind of strange that even those analysts in India that I personally know and thought were pretty rigorous in their analyses seem to be, cutting a lot of slack to the RSS government. Is that because of fear? Is that because of some kind of latent Hindutva tendencies, even in the more liberal ones?
I think fear is number one. I have a lot of friends in India who are either in films or journalism, and I talk to them all the time. Privately, they tell me that what's happening with India right now in terms of all this racism and Hindutva, they don't like it, but they're afraid. And they give me examples of, listen, this is what happened to this journalist, this is what happened to this producer or director, and they just don't want to take a chance. It's scary for them. They're afraid that their family might be killed or their office will be attacked and ransacked. So fear has definitely, and this whole fear thing was done in a systematic way. You know how RSS people would go and attack TV stations, and then they would make video films and they would post them and send them through social media. And that's what they do when they sit down with, when they pick up Muslims and they lynch them, they make videos and they post them. It is all done systematically to create this fear psychosis in India. And I believe that plays a major role. And also, maybe there was always a little bit of hate towards Muslims in India. I mean, I felt it when I was 16, 17. I give an example. When I went to Bombay, I was 18 years old, and I was looking for a room to rent. And every place I go to, and they asked me what my religion was, and if it was when I tell them I was Muslim, and they wouldn't give me a room. They said, you got to go to Muslim areas. And so there was always that hate between the Hindus and Muslims in India. So, but the fear, I would say, is the major factor.
Okay. I'm also joined by Mr. Rajesh Sundaram, who's a journalist. Thank you for being on the program, Mr. Sundaram. We were talking about the turn that India seems to be taking, especially under the second tenure of Mr. Modi's government, in terms of an exclusionary approach, in terms of street power, in addition to, of course, the head count in Lok Sabha. What is your reading of the situation? Because I was earlier talking to other panelists also, including Michael Kugelman, and people seem to agree that this is a slippery slope.
Well, I think there are two distinct things here. One is the Hindutva ideology and the philosophy of the ruling party, and indeed the Constitution of India. There are guarantees in the Constitution. There is an Article 14 which unequivocally says that everybody, regardless of the religion, caste, gender, has equal rights and equal recourse to the law. But unfortunately, what is happening, and the incident that the panelists before me recounted, I'm sorry to have heard about that. But there are guarantees in the Constitution, and the whole concept of Hindutva, unfortunately, lies against that concept. So what we are seeing right now here is that there are certain right-wing organizations, right-wing fringe elements which are now coming out and taking center stage. Does this, and they're loud, so the kind of messaging that they send out, it goes out. We have a media which does not give them the kind of coverage that they give to them is a very serious coverage, not the kind of coverage that they deserve. So all of that really adds up to an image that's going out.
Mr. Sundaram, let me ask you something. I agree with you. The Constitution is secular. It has certain guarantees. and that's a strong bulwark. But the problem is that the Constitution or the legal compact is effective only to the extent of the normative acceptance of it by large sections of society. Now, when you talk about fringe elements, I mean, before you joined us, we played some clips. Some of the clips we could not play because they're copyrighted. People going around social media, essentially messaging that no one should buy vegetables from Muslim vendors, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's just too many of it to count. So it's not just the fringe, it's something which is now sort of percolating through society.
Well, that is a very worrying trend, really, because we are seeing a whole lot of these incidents which are being blown up in the media. But of course, there can't be any smoke without fire. So there is some simmering which is there, which is actively fanned by a particular section of the media. And of course, those in power follow, the ruling party has an ideology which is right-wing. Hindutva does have certain elements about it if you read the literature, which intrinsically is discriminatory. So yes, all of this is coming out in the open right now. But it is unfortunate. This is something which I think civil society in India has protested. Those voices may not go out in the media. Those voices may not be loud. But clearly, this is something which is extremely worrying right now, especially given the kind of situation that we have with the COVID-19 crisis in India.
Absolutely,
Also,
Mr. Sundaram, I've run out of time, but before I wrap up, very quick question and an honest response to that. If today you were not a Rajesh Sundaram, but had a Muslim name, would you be worried?
Well, I have a lot of friends, and I do believe that they have reasons to be worried, but there are guarantees in the Constitution. There are institutional mechanisms which, at this time, things may seem a little desperate, but I'm confident in the Constitution because, see, if I'm a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh in this country, I have no recourse. There's nowhere else for me to go except for believing.
Absolutely, and except for believing that the Constitution will secure me somehow. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Tony Ashai and Rajesh Sundaram. This is it for this week. We shall see you next Thursday at the same time. For latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.